Hi, this is Khalil Golivala. Welcome to another episode of the BIPOC Manager Podcast. And today's episode, I'm really excited to have Alain Babineau with us of the Red Coalition. Now, after 30 years in law enforcement, including stints with the Ontario Provincial Police and the Military Police of Canada, Alain retired in 2016 at the rank of Staff Sergeant after 28 years of service within the RCMP. Alain is a jurist and trained mediator, and over the last few years, he has worked as an expert in racial and social profiling for the Office of the Commissioner for the Fight Against Racism and Systemic Discrimination for the City of Montreal, and as an advisor to the Centre de Recherche Action en Race Relations, CRARR, in Montreal. As director in issues of racial profiling and public safety, Alain will act as a spokesperson coordinator for the Red Coalition on issues of racial profiling and public safety, as well as a resource person accessible to all community organizations and progressive organizations. Alain, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Alain, I would love to start out by knowing more about Red Coalition, its history, its work, and your involvement with it, please.
Yeah, well, the Red Coalition is a non-for-profit organization that was created by Joël de Bellefeuille, who himself was a victim of racial profiling back in the it was about 2012, I think, that he first got victimized by racial profiling. And for about 8 years, really, he battled before the courts, the charges and also charges that he was saddled with through just racial profiling, and won. He won in 2020, where when the Human Rights Tribunal, basically a landmark case where the Human Rights Tribunal found the city of Longueuil liable for its police officers for having racially profiled Mr. de Bellefeuille, and ordered the city to two things. Number one, to collect race-based data, then to keep tabs on the disproportionate traffic stops and also street checks or interpellation that were racialized, Black and racialized people were being subjected to. And number two, provide anti-racism and anti-racial profiling training to its police officers. So that's a very unique ruling, which really attacked the core of the systemic issue of racial profiling. But it doesn't stop there, because 2 years later, and of course the city was given a specific timeline in order for which to put those orders in place. And roughly a year and a half later, the city hadn't done anything. So what the Red Coalition, and in the meanwhile, of course, Joël de Bellefeuille created the Red Coalition as a way to really provide assistance to those that have been victimized by racial profiling, but also to target discrimination and racism generally, not only in Quebec, but across Canada. So fast forward 2 years, as I said, the city of Longueuil didn't adhere to the court orders, and the Red Coalition took the city to court, basically a contempt of court, in order to force the city to deliver training and, well, to follow the orders that they were given by the court back in 2020. And I can't really discuss as to what transpired, but basically the case has been settled, and then we'll have to see, if Longueuil is going to, continue to advance in terms of minimizing racial profiling within its police service.
Amazing, Alain. And one of the things that I was sort of really interested by was the notion of like, if there's notion like challenging the belief that education can lead to reform. Like in recent articles, you want to be an ally. You mentioned dog.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about that, please?
Well, I'm a bit of a follower to Dr. Derek Bell, who's one of the creators of the critical race theory, in terms of which basically says that the way in which the North American structure is set up is fundamentally based on racism. Okay, and he sort of writes in terms of allegories. He tells stories, which really has a very profound meaning, allegorical, really, in ways that. So one of the stories, basically, he's challenging this notion that the more you educate somebody, the less racist the person is going to be. And he demonstrates that over time that has not been the case. And one of the things that we've at the Red Coalition that we've encountered racism in all spheres of life, regardless of age. We've had young children of elementary school being racially discriminated against, and also racism within that school, within the school system, all the way through to med school, really. And so it doesn't really matter. Education may create some type of awareness within somebody, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this person will take heed of their newfound knowledge of racism and change their ways. So there's no correlation or causal link between education and combating racism. And so at the end of the day, how does that apply to racial profiling? Is that the usual recipe that the police services have come forward in the courts and so on is training officers on to mitigate, to minimize racial profiling. While that may not be bad in and of itself, it's certainly not a silver bullet for elimination of racial profiling and racism across the country. So that's where my sort of stance takes, because I haven't seen any evidence that the more educated the person is, the less racist, discriminatory they're going to be.
Mm. One thing that you're saying makes me think about stuff. When I think about cops and police in particular, I think of like the old beat cop, where the place where they were known and seen. Is there a question of maybe embedding people versus educating someone? Is it about exposure? Is it about being part of these communities? Is that a potential avenue for this?
Right. Well, it certainly wouldn't hurt, but at the same time, this is 2024, right? So this is not like racism and discrimination, and it's a new sort of found reality. I mean, it's been part of our society, the foundation of our society. So there's nothing new here. Now, what has evolved over time in that is the ways in which racism and discrimination has demonstrated itself. It used to be, the jury basically entrenched in basic or obvious laws, as we had in the United States with Jim Crow legislations and whatnot, but also in Canada, it was part of the mores. It was part of the ways in which society was dealing with people of color, and we have cases that have shown that from the Violet Desmond to the Christie case here in Montreal, where back in the 50s, the gentleman was refused service at a local bar, and he took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically said that it was the right for the establishment to serve whomever they wanted. That's a freedom of commerce. So freedom of commerce superseded human rights at that time. Now it has evolved, of course. You wouldn't find that today, because the Canada and the provinces have established human rights institutions and tribunals and whatnot. But at the same time, the systemic aspect of nature of racism and discrimination has basically filtered into those systems, which make it very, very much more difficult to demonstrate the immediate impact of racism on an individual or a group of individuals. So it makes it more challenging from my perspective now than it was back in Christie's days, where it was pretty blatant, right? So you're a person of color, we're not going to serve you, get out of here.
Yeah.
Now it translates differently, but the results are similar, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think of the words like insidious and nefarious
Yeah,
because it's
absolutely.
something where, if if because everyone's kind of pretending that these laws no longer exist and they don't legally, but in behavior, in
That's right.
action, behavior, they are true.
That's
So
right.
and so in terms of education isn't sort of maybe the best option here. Are there other avenues? Are there other ways to kind of make, to
Well,
face this racist?
I mean, I'm not suggesting education is futile. I mean, I'm a strong believer in education and a proponent of it. But fundamentally, you have to develop within a society a sense of uh, accepting that people are different. There's this notion that race is just it's a fabrication and we shouldn't worry about race. And they have this narrative going around now, almost as a pushback to the to the what they call wokeism, right? So they have this notion of, stop talking about race, it doesn't matter, and there's no such thing as race, and there's only one race, the human race, which is very true. It's very true. There's only one race, and biologically, race doesn't exist. There's as much or as many differences between people of the same racial, quote unquote, racial group than there are between people of different racial groups. However, the ways in which society has constructed races and categorized people, I mean, we can go way back in the 1800s, how people were put in categories. It used to be physical, it used to be biological, it used to be narrative, which has basically created races as a social construct, which really is embedded in the ways in which we conduct our affairs in society. And sometimes it's very unconscious. People, but the notion that someone would tell you, well, when I look at you, I don't see race, is farcical at best, because we all do.
Yeah.
So the key question is, how do you treat people, even while recognizing that someone may be of a different, quote unquote, racial group? How do you treat that person? That's really fundamentally the issue, right? So race doesn't matter if everybody is treated the same, and everybody's, race, it doesn't matter. It's just an observable fact, if you want to call it that, but it doesn't have to have consequences. Unfortunately, it does. And so while race is not it's a social construct, it doesn't exist. Racism is very real. It's not a social it's a very real fact, and in effect, discrimination is also very real.
Yeah. And when you think so well, Elaine, it's also the consequences of it. Consequences are
Mhm.
life and death, work, quality of life, education, everything. This isn't just like a simple comment. It's really about the life people live and the respect
Exactly.
their neighbors.
Exactly. Across the board. As I said, from elementary school right on through med school. And again, and it's because people are being treated based on stereotypes and on beliefs and mores and society, which is constructed, which are constructed by their views or their opinion of a person's racial identity. And so it has absolutely horrific, I mean, we could go through the data in terms of stress, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of job. I mean, we can go through a whole gamut of things, but it has a horrific impact on people's lives. And unless society, you know, with governments in place are really determined to conduct themselves in a pluralistic society and accepting everyone as they are, this is not about to change.
Yeah. Maybe at the same time, Alain, maybe sort of another approach to it is you speaking of allyship, performative allyship versus true allyship.
Yeah.
You talk a bit about what the differences between these two.
Yeah, I had some reflection throughout the Black History Month in terms of like every year, we're sort of rinse and repeat the same type of events, where we celebrate this and first Black this and first Black that and all of that, and then on March 1st we go right back to business as usual, which means the lives of Black people and discrimination continues unabated. So I looked at this, and again, my observation in talking with people, and like I said, at all ages, all spheres of life, and on a daily basis. I mean, I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this. I talk to at least 3 people that are going through racism on a daily basis, on average. Sometimes it's more, but I rarely have one day that I don't talk to somebody about what they're going through. So what I'm saying is that allyship. So I reflected on this, and I said, well, the only way we can make the needle budge a little bit is if instead of having non-racist people who proclaims that they're not racist, and they take offense when they feel that they're being targeted as or called out as being racist, and they're not racist, and they don't see race, and they don't see color and all of that. Instead of having those people, which they might very well be non-racist, we start recruiting and encouraging people to be anti-racist. Now, what does that mean? Anti-racist basically means that, for example, if I'm using the sexism as an example, right? So if I say that I'm not sexist, but I walk into a room at a meeting at work, and my colleagues are, making sexist comments, and they're talking about that employee over there, and basically ruling or deciding on that person's career and where they think she fits in or doesn't fit in and all of that. And I'm not a sexist, but I remain quiet and I say nothing. Then I'm part of the problem, because it's not enough to say that you're not a sexist. You have to become anti-sexists. In other words, when you hear these things, you say something. When you see someone that's being discriminated against because of their gender, you call it out, or even you report it. Now, as an analogy, it's the same thing for racism, right? So if you say I'm not a racist, and I wash my hands of all of that kind of stuff because that's not me, but you tolerate jokes again about racist jokes, you see someone that's clearly being treated differently, and within the context you realize this is about the person's race or religion or what. And if you don't do anything about it, although you say, well, I'm not part of this, I don't agree with it, I'm not part of it, I'm not a racist, but you don't do anything more about it, you're part of the problem. Because and this is kind of my conclusion, is that when we start having white people reporting racist behavior, racist comments, and so on to their HR or to the Human Rights Commission and what have you, then unfortunately in our society, white people are given a little bit more credibility and credence in the court system and everywhere else than people of color when it comes to talking about racism. That's a fact. Otherwise, they'll think, well, you're a brown person, you think that way because you see racism everywhere. But when a white person starts calling out racism, then they're given this, what we call an advanced standing, a special standing in the eyes of and people start paying attention. Oh my God, okay, well, you know, I recently had I watched this podcast about Diane Harris, I think her name is, in the UK, who's been vilified and really in a horrific racist kind of rant. And there was this conversation between a Black woman and it's a panel discussion. There was a Black woman there and there was a white woman, and the Black woman, amazingly enough, but not surprisingly, started sort of saying, well, you know, it's not really racism, and I kind of felt bad for, it felt, you know, terrible what she said, and it looks bad. And the white woman was actually challenging that notion and calling out racism in a much more deliberate and direct fashion than the Black woman would. And so immediately you had that person who was definitely anti-racist, whereas the Black woman was kind of more trying to accommodating, trying to understand, and so on, trying to minimize and so in conclusion, once we start having more of those type of people, white people, that start calling out racism, report racism, talk about it, I would suspect that the needle is going to move much more rapidly than when we talk about it amongst ourselves, and we're trying to convince the converted that this is a serious problem. So that's why I say, you want to be an ally, good. Then start being an ally in action, report. When you see something, you know, that the terrorism when you at the airport, when you see something, say something, report it, and so on. And so this is a challenge that I'm putting out there to everybody that says they are an ally. Do something about it.
Amazing, Alain. Thank you so much for that. You know, I want to change tracks here a bit, and you know, where one of my experiences, at least being in Montreal here as an immigrant 20 years, is being is dealing with law enforcement. And for me, one of my main questions always has been, if I'm ever stopped by the cops, how do I get home? And researching on it, you know, the best advice I ever had was just leave your hands on the steering wheel and just comply. Any advice into what someone can do if they're stopped by, or they're having interaction with a law enforcement officer? What can they do to just make sure that they're able to get home safe to their kids?
Well, you just comply. I mean, I always tell people, you know, I always tell people, just comply and then live to fight another day. In other words, just comply, and then if you have grounds to feel that you've been discriminated against and you've got evidence, then let's go. Let's challenge the ways in which you've been treated. But at the end of the day, you know, like if it's 2 a.m. and you're alone, and you know, I mean, like, let's be real. I mean, police officers have tremendous amount of power. Still have tremendous amount of credibility, in the sense that in a court of law, you know, the words of a police officer over, you know, particularly a person of color, will weigh quite heavily. It's still. I mean, it's changing in some district and in some fashion in some courts, but generally speaking. So my thing is, you know, you think you've been discriminated against, treated wrongly, record. Recording is a must. Comply, and then file a complaint.
And if I can,
Very simple.
if I can check on the point, Alain, like in terms of, let's say, Quebec and Canada, like is it within their rights for someone to record interaction with the law
Sure,
enforcement officer?
100%. There's no law against that. Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you. Yeah, because I realized, just, you know, growing up watching TV, like I'm aware of the American situation with the Miranda rights, but I feel like if
Well,
any,
Miranda is the equivalent of our charter rights, right? The right to instruct legal advice without delay, a right to remain silent. It's all entrenched in our charter the same way. It's just that it's you know, in Miranda comes from the Miranda case, which is the jurisprudence of the United States. So it's not entrenched in the Constitution. See, the United States is very different in terms of they don't have, a quote unquote Charter of Rights. They have a constitution. Everything is based off of the Constitution as opposed to a Charter of Rights and Freedom, like what we have here in Canada and equally what we have here in Quebec in terms of Quebec Charter, which is a quasi-constitutional document. It's not, doesn't supersede the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, but it still has all laws in Quebec supposed to be in keeping with the Quebec Charter.
Thank you, Alain. And maybe, if I wrap up, and the question I want to ask you, Alain, is, like, what is your viewpoint of sort of the future? Like, how do you, is any sense of where society is going with dealing with minorities?
But no, I don't like that term, but I know what you're talking about. Where are we going? I mean, it's all about society being self-conscious or conscious, have an awakening of the fact that people of color, minorities, we call them immigrants and what have you, are not going anywhere. Okay, and it's not gonna happen. And we're living in a pluralistic society. As much as here in Quebec, try and make it very kind of nationally pushing the nationalism ideology, which nationalism in and of itself is not necessarily bad, but like any kind of movement pushed to an extreme, then it's not. It can have some very, very negative and racist effect, right? So, but that's how because nationalism, I mean, has created good things in the world, right? Has provided people with a sense of break free from bondage and oppression and what have you. So there's good things. But so where do we go from here? You need awareness. You need an awakening to the fact that racialized people are not going anywhere. They've been here, racialized people have been here for 400 years, not going nowhere. And the sooner we learn and we accept that we're living in a pluralistic society where everybody needs to be respected equally, then we're gonna keep finding these racist and discriminatory practices because it becomes ingrained in the ways in which people are educated, are formally and informally, and how they then in their occupations, whether it be a teacher, whether it be a lawyer, whether it be a police officer or a judge, and right across the board, how they will make decisions based on their education, meaning the whole education, the whole and so until, like I said, it has to be a societal awakening to the fact that we can't continue this way because like I honestly I see racism as a permanent fixture in this society, and because I haven't seen any evidence that it's going anywhere anytime soon. But it doesn't mean that we should abandon and give up, and people have been resisting oppression for as long as times immemorial, and so we got to keep doing the same thing. But the idea that this fanciful idea that things are getting better and people are more this, people are more. I'm not seeing that, and honestly, it's becoming more pernicious and more insidious, but the results are very, very similar. Very, very similar to the days where people would be refused employment based on race or kicked out of a hotel or restaurant based on it. It's done in a much more insidious fashion, but the end results are very, very similar.
Yeah. And then maybe a point I want to bring up, as I use the word minorities, is there a more appropriate term that should be used?
Well, minorities, and like I'm not suggesting it's bad. It's just that minorities sort of connote this notion that inferiority almost, and so I'm having sort of thought about that, and I'd rather use. We have vulnerable communities. You have vulnerable people. You have people of color. But don't forget discrimination uh, is not unique to people of color, right? There's discrimination all across the board, and so at the end of the day, until people are, pardon me, are treated with respect across the board, regardless of their race, ethnic origin, gender, sexual orientation, social status, even in this province, which is something good that's in the charter in this province. Social status is one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination, which is not the case in the Canadian charter. But so until people are treated fairly with respect and given a fair shake at the good life, because that's all it's all about, right? It's good life. Then we're not gonna move forward. So like I said, I just don't like the term minorities because it connotes this notion of inferiority. That's all. But maybe I'm being too deep about it. I don't know.
I know. I mean, this is where, like, so for me, my background, I'm of Indian background. I was born and raised in the Middle East in Dubai, and about 90% of us were from South Asia, meaning India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. But we were not citizens. We never had rights.
Mm,
Even though we were in sometimes the majority numerically,
mm,
right in front of the cops. I was harassed by the cops in Dubai. And
mm.
it was actually blatant racism, blatant, like you cannot go to certain posts or job positions because of your background.
Right.
And so when you said minority, it made me immediately think about that. In some sense, some places, even it's not even a question about majority, it's just a
Society.
vulnerable community of people
Exactly.
not rights. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a very, very good point. And you have the same thing in other countries where the majority is the oppressed people. We've seen it all over Africa, right? Um, and so, yeah, it's a very good point. Very, very good point.
Thank you, Elaine. And before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to mention? Anything you'd like to highlight?
No, it's a very it can be discouraging topic to be honest, and that's one of the reasons why often you don't see you see some media refusing to talk about it, right? Or when they do, they sort of sugarcoat it and projecting a some type of a oh, things are much better, things are improving, and blah blah blah. It's and so the less we talk about it, the less we care. It doesn't become a priority in terms of policy making decisions and whatnot. And so what we've learned over time and historically is that any changes, any improvement that have come about through resistance, uh, calling out and protests and community-driven initiatives to put an end to certain practices. The governments have never, from my knowledge, you can tell me otherwise, but I have never seen any government that has had an epiphany in and of itself and decide to make lives of minority groups, minority, I use minority, of vulnerable groups better. I haven't seen that anywhere in the world. And so it has come through resistance. It has come to, in some cases, revolutions, right? Of mind and also of revolution of physical revolutions. But so so drawing it back to this province, until we have a narrative that pushes and encourages pluralism instead of demonizing the others, and allowing people to be themselves, and allowing people to because most immigrants, regardless of their races, have come here because they left something that was not necessarily pleasant. Like, no one leaves a $4 million a year job to go where they're gonna have to beg on the street. You know what I'm saying? So people come here for a better life. So at the end of the day, people have not only do they have an incentive to contribute to their better life, but studies have shown that immigration has been very good to this country. So we have to change the narrative in this province, that in the fear of the others, and the same thing for religious minorities and whatnot. I mean, again, there's this fear. We have to change that, and we have to develop a posture of pluralism, where we have to work and live and coexist together in a constructive fashion, and that's the only way I see the needle changing in this province, particularly. Until then, but just to wrap up my thoughts here, we don't see that kind of narrative coming out of A, the government, and B, the media, the media from the majority. You don't see that kind of narrative, that kind of awakening. It's contrary. It's push back, and that makes it very, very difficult to effect a meaningful cultural, ideological change when this is not something that people hear every day. So I don't know. It has to come from the top. It has to, there's a process that can be put in place. But yeah.
No, I hear it. I see sort of it's about changing narratives, right? It's sort of like, there's a story I think we tell each other as maybe a certain groups, but what happens when that story gets expanded to include other groups that are not part of us?
Exactly. And until that story changes, the old stories, the old ways are gonna continue to affect all spheres of life, as I said, from elementary all the way to med school,
Yeah.
law school, law school too. I graduated recently from law. I'm still in law school, but I'm telling you, there's some challenges there as well. In the legal profession, judge, everywhere. There's great challenges, and I want to end. Well, I was going to end, but perhaps a conversation around. I'm involved with the Black Class Action Secretariat, which is a national organization that was born out of a landmark class action against the federal government. It's $2.5 billion against the federal government on behalf of federal Black employees that have undergone discrimination in their employment since the 70s. And so our organization that was born out of that class action is really targeting discrimination in the workplace across the board, across Canada, all spheres of life, not just federal, but all spheres, to challenge not only employers but also human rights bodies. For example, the Human Rights Commission has been found to have violated their non-discriminatory practices, right? So they've been discriminated against their Black employees for years. And the Treasury Board sort of issued a report. The Senate has ruled on it. And so that's one of the things that the Secretariat contributed to expose. And so we want to take that blueprint of what we've done at the federal level, right across Canada at every level, and hold those organizations accountable. Canada claims to be, in all provinces, they claim to be a very welcoming and tolerant and all of that for Blacks and people of color. And so we're saying, all right, well, put your money where your mouth is, right? And let's see how true that statement is and hold them to account. And so I encourage people to keep tabs of the work not only the Red Coalition do with respect to racism, but also to the Black Class Action Secretariat will do in the upcoming years in the work in the employment sphere of this country, because again, we're talking about being a welcoming and being a tolerant and all of that. Let's see what that translates into, and let's hold into account, right?
Yeah, amazing, Alain. I was actually going to ask you the last question, but in terms of people who want to kind of follow the developments of the Red Coalition or the other coalition you talk about, are there websites they
Yeah.
could go to get more information on those?
Yeah. I don't have I mean, Red Coalition, you just punch in on Google, you just Google the Red Coalition and it'll get to the website. With respect to the Black Class Action Secretariat, there are two websites. One is specific. So you go to the Black Class Action Secretariat, and then you'll get to that website and you'll see what the organization is about. And then within that website, you'll be able to link to the procedure, the legal procedure, which is Black Class Action against the federal government. So it'll give you an idea, but things are moving, and there's pushback. Since the George Floyd murder, which really was a catalyst for some type of awakening, and hence the word woke, right? An awakening among those that were asleep. Racialized people weren't asleep. I mean, we knew this was going on. We knew that this was happening. This was, but some folks got awakened, and those are the folks that ought to be called woke, is the folk that were awakened by the George Floyd, murder. That didn't wake me up. I knew this was going on. So anyway, since the George Floyd, there's been a tremendous amount of pushback now on all DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion measures that the governments and the public sector and private sectors have sort of performatively put in place to increase diversity and to anti-race, all of that stuff. So there's been a tremendous amount of pushback by those that don't want really things to change that much. You know what I mean? And the reason for that is that folks are afraid of losing their privileges, right? So they've been, folks have been in positions allowed to flourish in organizations for generations on end. And now they feel that they're sort of status quo and privilege to be threatened. So there's pushbacks on that, and unfortunately, people of color are taking the brunt of those kind of pushbacks. So it's something that both the Red Coalition and the Black Class Action Secretariat are very aware of, and pushing back against that backlash, and to make sure that we don't go back to the way it used to be, and that we keep pushing forward as to where we want to go as a society, right?
Yeah. Alain, thank you so much for being a guest today in the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and hope we can talk about it some more. There's so much more to talk about, right?
Definitely.